So, we hear a ton about digital sovereignty these days, right? Especially when it comes to securing our data and building out our artificial intelligence infrastructure. But here's the thing, relying purely on a company's corporate nationality to protect that data, it might actually be a massive structural flaw. As we'll see in this explainer, the way entire governments and massive organizations are measuring sovereignty might be completely fundamentally wrong. Just look at the sheer scale of this. Europe recently made a 20 billion euro bet. They essentially anointed a brand new sovereign AI champion. But get this, its parent company is Canadian. We are talking massive market-defining procurement stakes here, and it really forces an uncomfortable question. Did buyers just secretly change the rules of the sovereignty game without realizing the structural risk they were taking on? To figure that out, in this explainer, we're going to unpack 5 key areas. We'll look at Europe's 20 billion bet, why Canada looks so safe on paper, a fatal flaw in the global intelligence architecture, the inescapable reality of the US corporate nexus, and finally, what a real data sovereignty test should actually look like. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Europe's 20 billion vet, and the shift from a test to a proxy. European sovereignty quietly changed its core definition practically overnight. Historically, the really strict standard for European digital sovereignty was simply incorporated in the EU. But suddenly, for this major deal, that definition morphed into not incorporated in the US. You see what happened there? Europe adopted a proxy at the exact moment they actually needed a rigorous, measurable test. And as anyone in enterprise procurement knows, proxies always fail at the edges. Nationality is suddenly being used as a substitute for actual technical measurement. Which brings us to Section 2, why Canada looks safe, giving the Canadian defense its due. Look, we absolutely have to give credit where it's due, because objectively speaking, the Canadian legal defense genuinely is stronger than a lot of skeptics want to admit. The U.S. Cloud Act is an incredibly powerful piece of legislation, for sure, but it explicitly compels U.S. incorporated providers and their subsidiaries. It simply does not reach a Canadian incorporated parent company, and that's a real architectural difference. Plus, unlike the UK and Australia, Canada doesn't even have a Cloud Act executive agreement with the US. They've been negotiating one since March 2022, but years later, it's completely stalled out. So there is no fast-track bilateral instrument giving the US easy access here. And the Canadian courts? They completely back this up. The Supreme Court of Canada explicitly rejected the US third-party doctrine. That's the American legal principle where data handed to a service provider just automatically loses its constitutional protection. In landmark cases like R.V. Spencer and R.V. Bykovets, Canada has proven to be substantially more protective of data than the U.S. Aligning their digital surveillance laws is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible. So if your only standard is not American, well, Canada passes that proxy test with flying colors. But let's move to Section 3, the intelligence architecture flaw and the structural reality. So all of that domestic legal defense is totally true, but it ignores a massive structural reality. We have to acknowledge geopolitics, specifically the 1946 UK-USA agreement, which formalized the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. Canada is a crucial member. Now, to be fair, Canada isn't a rogue actor here. Their Signals Intelligence Agency, the CSE, operates under very strict oversight. Authorizations require sign-off from an independent intelligence commissioner who is a retired judge. Frankly, it's an oversight architecture that's better than what several EU states manage domestically. But here is where the proxy completely falls apart. The CSE is legally prohibited from targeting the private information of Canadians or anyone located within Canada. The legal protection is strictly national and territorial. Do you see the problem? That means Europeans and EU companies are, by definition, foreign. Under Canada's Bill C-59, which expanded foreign intelligence powers, European data subjects sit completely unprotected on the wrong side of that territorial line. So what we're looking at is a massive adequacy gap that nobody is really talking about when closing these giant deals. Yes, Canada holds a European Commission data adequacy decision, but it's based strictly on Canada's commercial privacy law, PPEDA. It excludes employee data, and more importantly, it was never assessed against Canada's intelligence laws or its Five Eyes participation. Guys, this is structurally identical to the exact flaw the European Court of Justice used to destroy the U.S. Safe Harbor Agreement in the famous Schrems I decision. Because of this, EU data subjects are effectively left in a remedial no-man's land when it comes to intelligence redress. Europe just bet 20 billion euros on a deeply, deeply unsettled legal question. Let's transition to Section 4, the inescapable U.S. nexus, or presence over passports. This is really the analytical core of our whole explainer. It's the critical difference between a company's corporate incorporation and its actual operational nexus. The Bank of Nova Scotia line of cases established a massive legal precedent spanning 40 years. It essentially says that U.S. jurisdiction attaches to a company's business presence and activity, its nexus. They will enforce subpoenas even if compliance literally violates a foreign law. A simple address on a Canadian incorporation certificate cannot protect you if your company operates heavily in the United States. You simply cannot write a contract to escape a court's jurisdiction if you operate in their backyard. What does this look like in the real world? It's creeping corporate exposure. For example, Canadian telecom giant BCE acquired the U.S. telecom Ziply Fiber in August 2025, heavily exposing them to the Cloud Act. TELUS employs over 1,600 people in the U.S. Shopify lists New York as a principal office and processes over half its transactions in the States. None of these companies changed their nationality, but they all radically expanded their U.S. nexus. Even Microsoft's massive December 2025 $19 billion Canadian AI pledges to resist U.S. legal orders are, frankly, legally insufficient if a U.S. judge determines a valid nexus actually exists. Now, let's layer some geopolitics on top of this legal reality. In July 2025, the White House AI Action Plan framed cloud dominance explicitly as a national security imperative. And by November of that year, the U.S. National Security Strategy pushed to replace foreign infrastructure with U.S. sole source contracts in allied regions. When you set a Five Eyes partner like Canada against these explicit geopolitical strategies from Washington, things get incredibly complicated. Sovereignty frameworks are supposed to survive the friendship ending. A standard that only works while relations are good isn't a standard, it's just a mood. Finally, Section 5, the real sovereignty test, prioritizing architecture over jurisdiction. So, if a passport or nationality is just a flawed substitute for measurement, what is the right standard? To find real, durable sovereignty, buyers absolutely must ask 6 vital questions. 1. Who holds the legal power to compel you? 2. Is there actual accessible legal redress for non-nationals? 3. What is your actual U.S. business nexus? 4. Who actually holds the encryption keys? 5. Can you exit the cloud environment in 12 to 18 months? And 6. Can the system be completely air-gapped? Notice how these questions stop being about abstract legal jurisdiction and start being about concrete technical architecture. This leaves us with an honest hierarchy of protection. At the very bottom, we have the proxy being not American, which is exactly what Europe just adopted. It fails on Nexus, it fails on Five Eyes intelligence laws, and it fails silently because nobody is actually measuring it. In the middle, we have the test being genuinely EU incorporated with strict ownership caps, like the Secnum Cloud Standard. But buyers have quietly stepped back from this. Finally, at the very top, the only position that truly survives a geopolitical shift is the architecture standard. Open weights, your hardware, your keys, and air-gappable systems. It requires trusting no jurisdiction, no ally, and no executive directive. Ultimately, every single sovereignty claim in this market is basically a jurisdictional bet. Sure, some bets, like relying on Canadian privacy law, are genuinely better than others, but it's still a bet. The only positions that don't require gambling are the ones where you hold the weights and can physically pull the plug. If your data sovereignty framework relies entirely on the hope that friendly international relations will never sour, you really have to look closely at your procurement strategy and ask yourself, are you actually buying a secure architectural standard, or are you just buying a mood?